get started. Welcome to the Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Kaylee. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm one of the event hosts here at the Booksmith. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few things. First off, please keep your phone silent during the event, and also, if you need to pick up a pre-ordered copy of The End of the World as We Know It, or if you'd like to purchase copies, you can do so at the end of the event at the register behind our event space. My last announcement is we are live streaming this event. We have our iPad set up right over here, so please just be mindful if you're getting up to go walk around or go to the bathroom or whatever, that you don't knock over the iPad, or if you don't want to be in the live stream. Yeah, thank you so much for supporting our store and these events that we get to host and the authors that we get to host here. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Christopher Golden, Paul Tremblay, and Catherine M. Valenti as we celebrate the release of The End of the World as We Know It, New Tales of Stephen King's The Stand. Christopher Golden is the editor of the anthology we're here to discuss, and the New York Times bestselling author of such novels as The House of Last Resort, All Hallows, Road of Bones, and the Stoker Award-winning Ararat, among others. He co-created the fan-favorite comic book series Baltimore and Joe Gollum, A Cult Detective, and has written and co-written comic books, video games, screenplays, and the online animated series Ghosts of Alderaan. His work has been nominated 11 times in 8 different categories for the Bram Stoker Award and has won twice. In 2023, Golden and Amber Benson co-wrote and directed the Audible original podcast Slayers, a Buffyverse story. Paul Tremblay is one of the anthology's contributors and has won the Bram Stoker Award, British Fantasy Award, the Sheridan LaFau Award, and the Massachusetts Book Award, and is the New York Times bestselling author of horror movies, The Beast You Are, The Pallbearers Club, Survivor Song, Growing Things, and Other Stories, The Disappearance at Devil's Rock, A Head Full of Ghosts among the crime novels The Little Sleep and No Sleep Until Wonderland. His novel The Cabin at the End of the World was adapted into a Universal Pictures film, Knock at the Cabin. His essays and short fiction have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, and numerous years' best anthologies. He lives outside of Boston with his family and has a master's degree in mathematics. Cat Valenti is one of the contributors of the anthology as well and is the New York Times bestselling author of over 24 works of fiction and poetry, including the Orphan's Tale series, Deathless, Radiance, and the crowd-funded phenomenon, The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. She is the winner of the Andre Norton, Tiptree, Sturgeon, Eugene Foster Memorial, Mythopoeic, Braceling, Lambda, Locus, and Hugo Awards, as well as the Prix Imaginalis. Valenti has also been the finalist for the Nebula and the World Fantasy Awards. She lives off the coast of Maine with a small but growing menagerie of beasts, some of which are human. And tonight we're here to discuss The End of the World as We Know It, a short story anthology based on master storyteller Stephen King's classic, The Stand. Since its initial publication in 1978, The Stand has been considered Stephen King's seminal masterpiece in apocalyptic fiction, with millions of copies sold and adapted twice for television. Although there are other extraordinary works exploring the unraveling of human society, none have been quite as influential as this iconic novel. Generations of writers have been impacted by its dark and ultimately hopeful vision of the end and new beginning of civilization and its stunning array of characters. Now, for the first time, Stephen King has fully authorized a return of the harrowing world of The Stand through this original anthology as presented by award-winning authors and editors Christopher Golden and Brian Keeney. Bringing together some of today's greatest and most visionary writers, The End of the World as We Know It features unforgettable all-new stories set during and after the events of The Stand. These brilliant, terrifying, and painful human tales will resonate with readers everywhere as an essential companion to the best-selling classic novel. Please help me in welcoming Christopher Golden, Paul Tremblay, and Cat Valenti.
Did you notice that when Ashley was listing Kat's various awards, the list was so long that she almost seemed to get bored halfway through. all right, keep winning awards. That's great. Thank you all for coming. As an editor who wrote nothing but a foreword to this book, I try to spend time talking to the contributors about their motivations and their backgrounds and all of this. Paul and I did an event together with another author, Rio Ewers, last week, so I'm going to ignore him the whole time. No, not the whole time. But I do want to start with you, Kat,
Okay.
because I want to sort of ask you both to sort of tell folks about your personal sort of history with Stephen King and specifically with The Stand, but so both generally with how Stephen King influenced you and then how The Stand in particular came into your life.
So, of late, I've had reason to consider what living writer has had a greater effect on me than Stephen King, and I struggle to come up with one. I really don't think that there could be one. Reading his books has been part of my life since I was 9 years old. Who's read the collection so far? All right, well, if you get to my story, it's toward the end. Also, I found out during the last signing that page 666 happens during my story. I'm very pleased about that. Oh my goodness. But it begins with a young girl sitting down on the floor of a garage and reading a manuscript. That was me when I was 9 years old. And I was supposed to be cleaning the garage, and I pulled out a box of old paper. I mean, they wouldn't have been old at the time, just red paperbacks. And it was Peter Straub, John Saul, and Stephen King. And I remember it was a hot August day, and the garage was cool, and looking at this box and all of the amazing 80s covers to horror novels. And, there were some B.C. Andrews in there too. And doing the math in my head, I am not supposed to read these books. And I can read faster than they can catch me. Because I've always been a very fast reader. And I sat down on the floor of that garage and started reading The Stand. Because it was the cover I liked the best. And no, it was the one with the fighting guys on the front. Yeah. And one of the things that we talked about at the Bangor release last week is that almost everyone remembers where they were when they read Stephen King for the first time. And I remember every sense of it. And I plowed through that box so fast. My stepmother was a massive Stephen King fan. She had an action figure, she'd have a Bud Light in one hand and a Stephen King book in the other. And when she found out what I had been reading, she was like, whoa, okay, back up. Read The Raft. I'm like, I just finished Salem's Lot. But they captured my imagination, not just my imagination, but my heart in a lot of ways. Not just King, but in a lot of ways I feel King still did it best. A lot of these kinds of books are about bad things that happen to kids. Even The Stand, which is not necessarily that oriented around children, we see everybody's childhoods and what happened to them. And I had a not great childhood. And these books felt to me like the only things that were telling the truth about how bad it could get to be a kid. They seemed like documentaries to me. And I think that there is something to be said for it having been 88 or 89 and like the bare understandings of the AIDS crisis, that there was a disease that was killing a bunch of people that as a 9-year-old I couldn't really understand how that worked, but like it seemed so real to me. And I never stopped. I had a brief pause after I read Gerald's Game when I was 13. So I was like, maybe I am not 100% ready for this. But like, I've never stopped reading Stephen King. He has been, I only met him last week for the first time, but in many ways my fictional mentor, though a lot of what I write is different. I started out as a horror writer. Has always been my great genre love. And King's works have guided me through my life, The Stand and It, and I think probably It is number one, Stand's number two, I think The Talisman's probably number three for me. And like each one of those, I know page numbers of when things happen and the lines that they use, because I've read it so many times that they are written on the backside of my skull. I remember starting to reread The Stand for the first time in a while when this amazing, miraculous request came in, and being like, oh my God, I have the foreword memorized. This is weird. I did not have to reread very much of it because I know it so intimately. I live in Maine. Usually I try to pretend like there's another reason. There's not. I got very invested in the idea, as the logic a child has, that Maine was where they kept the magic in America. Gross, horrible magic sometimes, but magic is like that. And if I could get there, I could have a sip. And 17 years ago, I moved to Maine very much because these books had just been, I don't know if anybody else was forced to read Everyman when they were in middle school, that play from the medieval era where like every man, his name's Everyman, he meets all the various parts of society, they all say, I won't go with you, I don't care about you in any way, and eventually Faith says, every man I will go with thee and be thy guide. These books were my guide.
Follow that.
So when I was 9 years old, I was not reading Stephen King. I was not even really reading. I was just like a weird little dumbass who watched a lot of television. So my first exposure to King was 80s cable television. You know, watching all the adaptations, including like Cat's Eye, like, you know, Cat's Eye. And I mean, it almost felt like in some ways like the Troll one, like a YA sort of version, except, you know, the quitter smoking thing, not so much. So I didn't try reading King, and I didn't really come to reading for pleasure until later than I'm sure the two people up here, most writers and most of you out there probably. But after I graduated high school, and 6 days later had super serious back surgery that was going to lay me up for the whole summer. And so I was like, oh, I've got all this time. I'm going to read. My parents had a little bookcase and they had Stephen King It. I just remember walking by and seeing It all the time. And like, I thought the cover was cool. I was like, oh, I'm going to try reading this book. And I got through the opening, Georgie chapter, and all I could see was my younger brother, who I was fighting with a lot, but I still didn't want him to be, dragged into a sewer and eaten, or killed. Sorry for the spoiler. So I mean, that was a book I literally threw across the room. I was like, nope, not going to be stuck in the house all summer, terrified. So fast forward through the end of my college career, I was a math major, humanities, and humanities was just like a hodgepodge of stuff. And one of the last classes I took was an English class, and in that class, like I read some stuff that was really cool. And my girlfriend, who's now my wife, Lisa, was an English major. So once we graduated, she's like, "Oh, happy birthday! Here's happy 22nd birthday. You should read one of my favorite books." And it was Stephen King's The Stand. And so I read it, inhaled it, and then when I went off to grad school for 2 years, we did the long distance relationship thing, and so I had all this free time. I just read all the King I could get, and through Danse Macabre, I found Peter Straub and Shirley Jackson and Clive Barker and all these other authors. And at the end of grad school, I had the weird itch to try writing a story. I'm a reader because of Stephen, never mind like a writer. So when Chris, sent the emails like, hey, we'd love you, we'd like you to write stories, set in The Stand, approved by Stephen King. And I was like, fuck yeah. But as soon as I sent the email, then I was like, oh no. What am I going to do? I mean, it just felt too big. Because, I wanted it to be a good story. I also wanted it to be obviously set in The Stand. I kind of wanted it to be a little piece of me in there somehow too. So honestly, my way in was a little bit of a logic experiment. It was like, okay, in the guidelines, I know Chris, sorry Steve, if you're listening, Chris likes the abridged version better. Like that's the original version you read, correct?
I love both versions, but I do have my heart is with the original version.
He likes the original better, he says. That's true. But the anthology, what's being treated as canon, is the unabridged, which means the Superflu hits in 1991. So I'm like, oh, 1991. Like, what the hell was I doing in 1991? which is right around the time where, well, I started discovering, Stephen's written work. But I was like, in my own head, I was like, I know two characters who were around in 1991. I wrote this book called The Pallbearers Club, which came out in 2022. If you go to Goodreads, it's my lowest star rating. Don't let that stop you. So my story in The Stand really imagines like an alternate universe for the same two characters that are the main characters in The Pallbearers Club. You do not have to have read The Pallbearers Club to read the story in The Stand. It's a totally like standalone thing. Honestly, some of it was like, they're giving me this one chance to play in Stephen King's universe. I want to stick two of my people in there, which is a little bit of self-serving, I will freely admit, but also at the same time, it was just like a lot of fun. In a way, for me, I wanted to try to, even though the canon is 1991, Stephen wrote this in the 70s, so like, I wanted a little bit of like 90s, Gen X, punk, alternative sort of point of view, what that point of view might look like when some of these characters were presented with sort of the early choice within The Stand, right? When we first have survivors. It was a blast to write, and I'm forever honored to be included. Thank you, Chris.
How many fuck yeahs did you get?
We got a lot of fuck yeah.
I'm pretty sure I did an all caps fuck yeah.
And I did get for the one or two people who passed, one of whom was just such a time issue. In fact, I think he said yes and then withdrew later. It was just a time issue. I did get an email from him this week saying, congratulations, great job, super excited, and really, really regretting that I was not able to do that. Paul also, putting the characters from Pallbearers Club in The Stand was sort of like putting yourself into The Stand, because that book is very, very you in that regard. Kat, what about so Kat's story is called, am I saying this right, Came the Last Night of Sadness, is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's the next line in the song, in the Don't Fear the Reaper song that King quotes in the beginning. It's just the next line that comes after the last line he quotes.
Yeah. So, people who follow Paul and Stephen King on social media are probably aware that Steve has been a big supporter of Paul's for a while, which is fantastic. And he's done very nice things for many of us in the field. Kat, I emailed you recently to warn you that he was going to appear at the Bangor signing with you. And simultaneously, I also told you that while he was reading the stories, we would get, updates. Brian Keane and I would get sort of update emails about the last few stories he'd read and his excitement about various things. But we only got one where the title of the email was the title of the story. And the title of the email was Came the Last Night of Sadness. And the entire body of the email, because his emails tend to be extremely short, was, what a great fucking story. So I told Kat that seconds after I told her that he was going to be at the event, and you tried not to cry.
I tried so hard not to cry. I nearly almost didn't cry. People afterwards when they got their book signed said, "You did a great job not crying," because it was so clear that I was like, don't you do it, not in front of all these New England men. Don't you cry. Come on, you can pull it together. But like, there kept being moments where it was very hard to not cry. And I'm an easy crier anyway. I'm bad at hiding big feelings, and tears are my emotional or my physiological response to a wide range of emotions. It's very hard for me to not cry. However, it's Stephen fucking King. And I just told you how much all of this has meant to me. And you guys didn't tell me anything about what he thought of my story in this whole process. So I was like, well, maybe you didn't like my story. I guess that's okay. You know, like at least I got to.
Until right before.
Until right before, so that I could just be like emotionally vulnerable to a maximum extent. But yeah, so after I said, oh my God, are you fucking kidding me? Yes. In the email asking me to do it. And I do want to say that, like, the beautiful week I have had, where I'm not going to cry fucking now. The beautiful week I have had,
We're all here for
meeting
you.
my hero and being part of this and all that is completely down to Chris, who is, I keep just saying to people, yeah, he's a great writer. He's a great guy. He's a great guy. And the definition of a mensch. I'm gonna keep going. And years ago at the Merrimack Valley Festival, we've been talking, and I think I said something about that history with Stephen King and how much, when I was young, like horror was everything to me. I didn't start reading science fiction or fantasy till way later. Like horror was all of it. And I said that nobody ever remembers that, like, my first bestseller was on shocklines.com. I don't know if any of you know what that is or remember it, but it was an indie horror site. Like, that was my first love. It was my first book. It was my first everything. And when he replied to my all caps email, he said, I remember that you said no one ever remembers. This is what you do. It is. But my story, I didn't know what I was going to do for all that. Like, you say yes, and then you're like, And because they had given all of us a choice that we could do a prequel, we could do something within the time period of the book, or we could go past the ending. And like immediately I was like, I'm going past that ending. Like, that was the only idea I had at all. And I was late and I was long. Which is kind of the story of my life. But at some point you guys emailed me and was like, can you go past the ending? Because like no one's going past the ending. Because it's really intimidating. Like, it's, even if you're very confident of your skills and you have a track record and everything, it's Stephen fucking King. Like, going past where he decided to stop is a tall order. And weirdly enough, I was talking to my dad, because my stepmother being such a big fan, as soon as I hit send on that email, I called her. She does not read science fiction. She does not read fantasy. This is the only time she's cared what I do for a living. But super in like high energy, high school mom invested in this. And they were like, well, what are you gonna do? I'm like, I really genuinely have no clue. And my dad was like, well, you gotta put the girl in the garage in it. And I was like, I mean, it seems self-indulgent, Dad. But maybe, but when I started thinking about that, I'm like, well, what possible justification could there be in a post-stand universe for like a girl hanging out in a garage? And a girl started to take shape in my head, and I don't really want to say who she turns out to be, because that's kind of the thrust of the story. But I have always been very interested in going quite a long way past where we usually end up in post-apocalyptic stories. Like, I'm not that interested. The Stand was one of the first big ones, and certainly the first one I read. I'm not that interested in right after, but I'm very interested in like 150 years after, 200 years after. Like, how does this go on? And I remember the ending of, I really get mixed up with the abridged and the unabridged, but with Randall Flagg and the wheel turning and the huge illustration, I think it is the unabridged, of his new self kind of greeting all of these people. I fully thought that was another planet. I think I was in my 20s before I was like, maybe that's not another planet. I really thought it was. And that sort of sense of how big the world could be and how far it could go was kind of where Fern started taking shape.
No, I was just gonna say, you forwarded me what Stephen said about my story too. It just said, trembling, what the hell?
He actually asked me to forward that to you. No, I think I'm gonna chime in now about this whole thing, which is overwhelming. When unlike what Kat said, I can't remember my first Stephen King moment. I remember buying Salem's Lot in B. Dalton, no, Laureate's bookseller, for those older people here. And that might have been the first, I think it probably was. But I quickly then read Night Shift and The Shining and Carrie, and I don't think I read them all before The Stand. I think I read Salem's Lot and Night Shift and Carrie. And I was going to my grandparents. My family was traveling to Florida to visit my grandparents, and in the airport bookstore was the original paperback of the abridged version with this cover. I'm pretty sure I was either 12 or 13 years old. I'm not 100% sure. And I had to own it. I read the back cover, and I was not put off by the size of it. I was excited, and the red eye of I just remember being completely entranced by this cover. And I also remember about it that I read the last 300 or so pages in one night, and I read until about 3:30 in the morning, because I had to finish. I had to know how it ended. So thank God it wasn't the unabridged at that time, because I would have been up till noon the next day. But it has been, The Stand has been my favorite novel, period, since that day. And I've read it, I think, 5 times now, which is nothing in comparison to Kat or to Brian Keene, who claims to have read it every year since that year, because we're the same age, and he read it around the same time I did. So Brian, if you watch this, I don't believe you. But I'm sure he's read it dozens of times at this point, because we're both old. And so it came about because Brian and I had done this book of stories by various authors in the world of Joe Lansdale's The Drive-In. We did this anthology. I had said prior to that it was my last anthology, and then when I did that one, I said that was my last anthology. But that was so much fun because my life has been dedicated to trying to get other people excited about the things that excite me, and getting people to have the same emotional response to things and enjoy the things that I enjoy. And so doing that book about the drive-in was sort of the purest version of that I've experienced in publishing, because it was gathering up a whole bunch of really fucked up writers who also were twisted by that book and saying, like, let's sort of celebrate this thing. And so after that, I was just sort of, I don't know, I was sitting around one day and I was thinking, oh man, you know, it'd be amazing if we could do The Stand, because I knew it was also Brian's favorite book. But, you know, Steve will never say yes to that. But I called Keene anyway. I was like, you know, it'd be amazing if we could do this. And he's like, well, let's ask him. I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? Let's ask him. Right? He can only say no. And so I emailed him, and it took about a few hours, and his response was 2 words: do it. And it is impossible to go back in time and tell myself how easy and seamless and beautiful this process would be, because not because of the authors, by the way. Let's just get that out there. I did have to chase a few people, but because he made it so easy every step of the way. Anything that you know that we needed to ask him, he was, you know, quick response. You know, just sort of being hands off, but also supportive at the same time was amazing. So all this process was great. We had the full manuscript, and I was excited. Okay, here we go, and I sent it to him. And as soon as I hit send, I was like, fuck. Because I'd been so engaged in the work of it and the excitement of it, that up until that moment, it hadn't really occurred to me what we were actually doing and what it meant to the kid version of me and the adult version of me too. Like what it really meant which is, again, I always say, and I've said it 1,000 times, that Stephen King's writing is the narrative voice of my youth. You know, it's you know, if sometimes I hear it as Richard Dreyfuss because of Stand By Me, but his writing is the narrative voice of my youth. So much of who I am comes from reading those books, and when we hit send, all of a sudden the possibility that it would crash and burn and be a complete disaster, and he'd be like regretting that he'd said yes and that he wouldn't like the stories or that he wouldn't like the book would loom so large. And then as soon as we started to get sort of updates from him on his reading process, I wasn't even sure how much he would read. Did he want to get into it, or did he want to sort of stay away from it? You know, I couldn't be prouder of the work all the contributors have done and of the book that we put together. And I will say that the book came out a week ago today. Last week it was the number 7 book in Canada, period. Number 5 book in Canada, and the number 7 book on Audible. We won't know until tomorrow if we make the New York Times list. All of that is great, and it's exciting, and it's testimony to what, you know, to the work everybody has done, and the fact that everybody else loves this thing enough to also want to play in this world again. But it doesn't matter in the scheme of things. Like, it's not nearly as cool as just having done it and having been, you know, involved in doing it. So that's my thought process on that. Anyway, have you guys read any of the other stories?
A few. It's been jumping around because it's been so crazy with book tour, and then I just turned in the final edits of a new book that's coming out next summer. So I've jumped around to the people that I knew. Yeah, so about everything I've read so far has been awesome.
I've read Catriona Ward's story because I'm obsessed with her and I'm reading everything that I can by her. I finished a book like 10 days ago, so I only just kind of emerged, and I have a 6-year-old who had never seen my face do the things that it did when I got the email about Stephen King coming to Bangor last week. And like the 6-year-old was like, is everything okay? And I was like, that guy, see that shelf? Those 2 shelves? I get to meet that guy. And now they want to be Pennywise for Halloween next year. They don't know who Pennywise is. They just said that evil clown you said. I was like, that's a great costume for a 7-year-old. And have named like multiple stuffed animals Stephen King. They don't know who he is. They're just trying to be supportive.
They just knew that Mom got excited.
Mom got real excited.
Absolutely.
I just want to add briefly, sorry, but of the few that I've read, like Poppy Z. Bright's story is wild. And that story sort of broke my brain in a couple ways, because when I first got serious into the writing community, you know, Poppy was like one of the first known writers who like had said, hey, I liked your short story, that was on gothic.net. You know, and I was just so blown away. And I knew that Poppy, you know, loved King's work. So like, I mean, there's just so many cool things about this book, but to see, you know, a story from Poppy, you know, in here, doing Poppy's thing, it's amazing. So of the few that I've read, that's a standout. And Sarah Langan, similar to yours, takes place after, like many years after, and it's really wild and interesting, and something that could have only come from Sarah, too.
I mean, I think one of the really beautiful things about this anthology is that in many ways it's like a survey of all the horror since Stephen King, that Stephen King has influenced. Like, there's so many generations of horror writers in this anthology. It's just, you know, every decade it completely turns over, and it's more or less all represented here, and that's such a lovely thing and a testament to how much he's affected not just horror writers either, you know, all kinds of writers, and how much he has been part of the American imagination, truly.
You know, I'll quickly say, because I say this all the time, that I truly believe that Stephen King is one of the great American writers of the 20th century. And I say 20th century because I think that his 20th century works and even some of the later works really define so much of American consciousness and pop culture from the 20th century. His 21st century books, fantastic, but when we're talking about the landscape of America in that century. And as far as the, horror, and again, the book has a number of writers who are way more known as thriller or mystery writers and other things in it as well. But horror has a breadth and depth as a genre that it has never been as amazing as it is right now. And it was very intentional on Brian's and my part to try to represent the breadth and depth of and diversity of the horror genre as it stands right now, but also the various sort of styles of horror, which I think you encounter all different kinds of horror styles, writing styles in and subgenres and things in this book. Yeah, I think, go ahead, Paul, you had something.
No.
So, I'm trying to remember something else I was gonna say. You were talking about Langdon before
I
that.
mentioned a couple of specific stories.
Oh, Poppy. So, in case anybody is unaware of this, just to make sure that it's clear and that we know what we're talking about. Billy Martin writes as Poppy Z. Bright, even though, so Billy is a trans man who writes still under the name Poppy Z. Bright. We're well aware of that, but when we're talking about the story, we're referring to a Poppy Z. Bright story. It's still a Poppy Z. Bright story, just for clarity, so everybody knows what we're talking about. That story is batshit crazy. It's not the only batshit crazy story in the book, but it's the one, like, I feel like when the time comes when my wife reads this book, that's the story that's going to make her come into the room and go, really? And she's right over there, so she's, and it's, but it is such a great story, and I was so happy that this book gave us the opportunity to drag Billy back to writing, because after the events of Hurricane Katrina, Billy and his husband live in New Orleans. Billy had not written fiction since Katrina, not a word of fiction that whole time. And when we made the deal to do this book, I immediately messaged him and said, hey, we're doing this book and I'd really love it if you'd write a story for it, because I knew if anything was going to get him back, it would be this, and it did, and the story is an absolute banger, and I think he's written some more stories since then, so it just makes me like so happy that he's represented in this way. So anyway, all right, what do you think? Should we do questions?
Sure.
Okay. Who has questions? Some of you have some questions. So Ashley's like, you take away my job. No, I mean, I'm saying, you're saying I'm taking away your job.
I told you Chris wasn't that great of a guy.
You can have my job if you want, if you really want.
Questions, come on, I know you have.
You do have to ask though, or it gets off.
Yeah, go ahead. I know people have questions, they just.
So, since you're all writing within the same universe, was there any kind of, I suppose, quality control to make sure you don't have two people writing contradictory stories?
Well, I'm glad you defined quality control, because Paul's here. He's in the book, so no.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, so basically Brian and I wanted to cast as wide a net as possible and give freedom as much as possible. The thing that tends to surprise people is that it wasn't Stephen King who said, don't let anybody use my characters, although he might have. It was me and Brian who said, well, first of all, we did want to get permission from him for anybody who wanted to include one of his characters in a story. But our rule was, you could have dreams that had Mother Abigail and Randall Flagg in them. You could have scenes set in Vegas or Boulder or other places where characters from the book might be encountered, and we could sort of see those characters, but we didn't want them to be the main characters in any of the stories, with one exception, which we got dispensation from Stephen King for. And that was because we felt like if the writers were writing stories about their favorite characters from The Stand, they wouldn't really be inhabiting the world of The Stand. They'd be sort of, doing that sort of fan fiction thing where they're just having so much fun instead of really creating and really kind of searching for inspiration in that world. And so that was sort of the overarching rule. And we did say, could you could do it in one of these 3 sections. 2 people did stories that were so fucked up that they didn't fit in any of those sections, so we have a 4th section at the end. And there did come a point where we were getting sort of more stories set during the outbreak than we were later, and especially after. So I did send an email to the stragglers, who really weren't late because we had built in plenty of time, because we've done this many times by now and we know how it goes. To say like, hey, if you're interested in writing stories set afterwards, we would love that, because we're not getting, that's the one area we're kind of light on. And other than that, the big quality control issue, we did ask them sort of tell us what the story's about.
And you shot down my trash can man, Oscar the Grouch, by the road trip. I was very upset.
I didn't you already sell that to Morrow as you and Steve are collaborating on that as a novella? No, it was, it was just about trying to make sure nobody was, really stepping on each other's toes. And I will say, I try at events that he's not at, even though I tease him mercilessly, that Brian's job, by and large, his biggest job on this book, other than editing, was keeping track, getting the stories in the correct order. They're in the order in the book they are, because he really focused on the timeline. And he also made sure that, like, if somebody's story took them, within, a certain distance of where Trash Can Man blew up an oil refinery, and there might be smoke at that time, that you saw the smoke. Those kinds of things that he was really sort of focused on. Nerd, yeah, exactly. Well, we also had Bev Vincent doing a timeline for us. He did a phenomenal story in this, but he also provided us with a great timeline and answered questions that we had, like, Bev, can you remind us which animals died and which animal of the superflu and which didn't? And we just we had a lot of people we had to go back and say, listen, you can't have, there can't be a lot of dogs in this book. And that sort of thing. But as far as in general, the quality control was just who we asked,
One thing I found interesting, now that it's come out and everything, is how many, actually I think I have the notebook where I was brainstorming ideas in my purse right now, but how many ideas I had for stories that ended up in the anthology. Like, I live on an island in Maine. I thought about an island story. I thought about an orbital story. There's several ideas that I had that are in other places in the anthology. I think there was kind of a communal brain sort of trying to find a place for ourselves in this story, because so I've done other media tie-in work, sometimes for things that I love, sometimes not so much. A few years ago, I decided to prove that I could just do a thriller, do a pew-pew. I don't always have to be fancy. This is a safe space. I wrote a Minecraft novel. I fucking despise Minecraft. I have no interest in Minecraft whatsoever. And so I deconstructed everything that bothers me about Minecraft. You can't fucking do that with The Stand, man. I don't have a list of bitch points that I want to just get in there and stick it. No, you don't want to deconstruct this too much, because A, it's rude, and then B, you love this thing and you want to, a certain amount of deconstruction, but I think I do that too, but there is so much love that you want to be respectful of it at the same time that you are finding, some kind of cavern that you can hollow out to put your own voice and your own interests and the things that this book did to your brain. And I think that is kind of the fascinating thing about how many stories there are in this and how many different kinds of writers, is that everybody kind of went burrowing into a different hill to find their place.
Deconstructing The Stand?
My story's called The Sit.
Yeah, I know. What an easy audience. Where is the rim shot when you need it? Yeah, I mean,
Next question.
no. Yeah, next question. I had something. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
So I heard that, I think it was Stephen King who talked about the 3 types of horror. And there was like the gross outs, like the slasher, and then the horror, and then the terror. And I was wondering if you have a favorite type of horror, or alternatively, what type of horror do you think your story fits into in the anthology?
So before these guys answer that, I'll be the nerd and say that I believe the quote is something like, I try to terrify, and if I can't terrify, I try to horrify. And if I can't horrify, I go for the total gross out. And yeah, I mean, I think there are many different kinds of horror, and even though I didn't write a story in the book, which I now deeply regret because in his introduction, Steve said he wishes Brian and I had written stories in the book. But I try to unsettle people, which is a sort of different, I'm sure that he would have included that, but I don't know. Because that's the kind of horror I like to read. I like to be bothered.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's so many different types of horror stories and different ways to approach them. And I think this book is proof positive, as as Chris talked about, sort of the diverse array of not only authors but of voices and approaches to the subject matter. So to me, that's like the cool, exciting thing about horror. I always imagine it as sort of like this endless tent where so many things fit under it that maybe some people don't assume fits under it. Similarly to Chris, like I try to treat every story different. I tend to gravitate towards, I do think horror in 2025 in particular, like my job is to disturb the reader. There's many different ways to do that. I want to make the reader feel uncomfortable. That also means even making the reader sort of like on my side of sort of the political street, make them feel uncomfortable too, like make them really question and make sure, they decide, oh yeah, this is what's right. But how do you do that by, maybe pushing the envelope a little bit. So for example, my story is not a huge spoiler, but like the question about whether you go to Boulder or Las Vegas, maybe it isn't so black and white, or should it be, or depending on like how it's presented to you. So I kind of wanted to dig into that, maybe in an early 90s kind of way. So I don't know, like the stories that affect me the most, and obviously Stephen King has done it over and over again, are the stories that disturb me. I think horror. I mean, obviously, horror stories has a transgression. I would hope is, we all want this to be on the bestsellers list, but I still hope that horror is always sort of the freaky, weird, outsider fiction area. So I think that's where it best operates, where it gets to poke and prod at the outer boundaries of the wider, culture, and ask the tough questions that maybe, all genres can ask tough questions, but like horror's questions can be done in sort of a uniquely horror way, like in the language of horror. I just said horror like 5 times in 10 seconds. I think that might be a record.
Yeah, so one of my favorite books is Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle. And, in as much as The Haunting of Hill House has a more famous opening, I think in some ways the opening of We've Always Lived in the Castle is better. And it is, if you haven't read it, just look it up, read the first paragraph, and know there's something profoundly wrong with that person. And I love that. That you can't quite, that's not right. And you can't quite put your finger on what it is, and that's what keeps you reading. And I think that was the kind of horror that I was trying to do with my story, that Fern is not right at all. And it's a slow burn of what exactly is wrong with her and why it's wrong with her and where it all comes from. I mean, for all the character thing, I got to write Randall Flagg. I'm going to be happy about that forever. It's some of the foulest shit I've written in a while. Occasionally when you write a lot of middle grade books, you have some swears you need to get out. But yeah, I think I tried to go for the horrify rather than the terrify. When I first started trying to figure out what I was going to write, I did kind of for all that I said all that, I kind of went at it from a deconstructive angle, like, well, okay, what do I want to say about the stand? What do I have to say about the stand that isn't I love the stand? And one of the things that kept coming up to my mind is, I'm pretty sure they're straight up fucked in Boulder. I have family in Colorado. That is a bad place for subsistence farming. Terrible place, actually. I don't know that things go so well as all that, just because like people are, on the side of light. And so there's a whole bit about a whale in the story, and I think that the whale bit is kind of the story, the big story writ small, about what a whale fall is, a dead whale that falls to the bottom, and it can go on for a long time with the whole ocean feasting on it, but only a little while. And I actually had to pull back on that, because I'm like, no, you can't actually undo the ending of the stand. You are going to have to bring it back around to be a little more okay than all that. But I think that I tried to go for the literary character study, Shirley Jackson kind of horror with it.
Other questions?
I know some of you. I know some of you are.
Sorry.
Joe.
How do you guys feel about the walking through being in the White House with
I wouldn't give him credit. I would say he's more like
You can't
trash.
walk that well, man.
Yeah. He's more like the trash can man.
It seems like it's that kind of a world.
I-
Stan is more relevant than ever.
Yeah, I was saying last
Harold
week.
Lauder with public speaking lessons.
We did an event last week, and we talked about this and how I recently had occasion for a podcast to rewatch the early 1994 Mick Garris directed miniseries adaptation of The Stand, and it has its good. It has some really excellent stuff in it. It has some really great casting. It also has some not so excellent stuff and some really bad casting. Molly Ringwald. And yeah, that's I'm stumped by watching her. But in any case, the thing that struck Connie and me while we were watching this thing is how unbelievably prescient, like the behavior of people is just so like, oh, this is just real now. And never mind the superflu, which hey, by the way, coming back to a home near you very soon now that we're not allowed to be vaccinated anymore. Yeah.
Enjoy this.
Yeah, enjoy this. Enjoy this gathering, friends. But yeah, Joe, it's unbelievable, and I know people get weirdly uncomfortable. Like some of you probably are kind of like, oh, we're talking about this and we don't want to be talking about it. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We have to be really public about how these things that horrify us, that should horrify us, are all around us now. Every single day we're breathing it in, like we're breathing this poison in, like we're gonna, we're just lobsters in the pot with a slow boil at this point. And I just, I'm going off on a tangent, but that's what I do. So I'm glad you asked the question. We typically don't spend a ton of time on it, but it is eerie how prescient the book really is in so many different ways. And it also is really disturbing to see how many people grew up reading and watching things that showed them who the good guys and the bad guys were every single day, and yet still somehow they're like, yep, I'm one of them. Yeah, anyway.
I remember I was in Australia in March 2020. We got home skating under the door of lockdown. But I remember watching on Australian television, the events in America, and sitting in a house full of Australian people, and I said, better turn off your pumps hat, which is a line from early in The Stand that I don't know why that one always stuck with me, but it always did. And better turn off your pumps hat. And nobody got it, and I was like, well, you will in a minute. But yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I can only add fuck Trump. How's that?
Yeah. And all of them. Anyway, a more uplifting story about the apocalypse. No, the question, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This is amazing. Ever since I heard about this, I've been so excited. There's so much that I love about this book. But I think one thing that I feel really deeply is a sense of connection with the characters. You know, I've read the book multiple times. They're like family. You know, I step into this world, and even though everything's falling apart and some of the like greatest, most visceral horror ever, you know, happens within these pages, I still feel comfortable. You know, I still feel a strong sense of identification with a character like Larry Underwood and like his dynamic journey. So I'm wondering about you and kind of your experiences over the years, you know, with these characters, with this world, you know, other characters that you identify with, that you feel inspired by or in conflict with, you know, in a productive way, or you know, what's your relationship with the characters in this book? I know Paul likes Trash Can Man. But who doesn't?
I also unsettlingly can understand the Trash Can Man. It would be unfair of me to give a thorough answer to the question because it would be sort of a cataloging of so many of the characters and why I love them. I always say that, you know, I grew up, I mean, my parents got divorced when I was 11, but even before that, my dad wasn't around that much. And I always say that I learned right and wrong from reading comics, right? So I had a very black and white version of you know, what you're supposed to do and what's right and how you're supposed to behave. Well, from comics and from S.E. Hinton. True story. The Outsider is huge for me, and so Stu was like the ideal guy for me. That was like my guy, and he still is. And but there are so many characters in the book that I love so much. Tom Cullen, Nick Andros. You know, I really. My heart breaks for Nadine every time I read the book. So there are so many, but I'll just share a weird little anecdote, which is, I don't know if you're also like this, but my emotions tend to sneak up on me. And so like at the end of a movie, I won't really realize how much it's affected me until I try to speak. And then I'm sometimes can be overcome with emotion from having seen the movie or been affected by it. The fourth time I read The Stand, I got toward the end, to the scene where they're celebrating, I think they're celebrating May Day at the end, and Stu and Franny are having a conversation about what they're gonna do next, like where they're gonna go. And there's a reference to the children playing around Brentner Rock. And I started crying for Ralph Brentner, this sort of like tertiary, well, I guess secondary character who had such an impact on me without me even really realizing that he was. I mean, I love Glenn, there's so many of these other characters, but it was just so weird to me that like the fact that they honored him in that way and his sacrifice in that way and what a sort of regular guy he was. And it just goes to show what you were saying is like the magic of the novel is that you spend all this time with these people, some of whom are behaving really shittily, some of whom are just trying to survive and doing their best, but they're all human beings, you know, like even Flag, for all of his masquerade, tries to make everybody think he's the devil, right? And as horrible and evil as he is, when he realizes he's losing, and he loses his shit completely, and you see the vulnerability and weakness in him. You're like, aha, you're no better than the rest of us, right? And I don't know, that to me is the thing that I think really nailed down what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So.
I loved Nadine most the first time, most every time, because no one ever loved her. And the thing about her, she's so different than everyone else because she's been in the mystical part of it for years before Captain Trips happens. She grew up in it. It's what I was talking about how bad it can get to be a kid, that evil can come for you real early. And I felt so bad for her. And she never even got to have her baby to love her. And remember that I said that when you read my story. I was fascinated by her, completely fascinated by her. One of the things that Stephen King's books gave me as a young, AFAB reader is much has been made that his sex scenes are not always the best, and sometimes they're a little wild. However, very often in Stephen King's sex scenes, the girl's in charge, and that wasn't something that I read anywhere else. It was always something that happened to the girl. And Nadine's trying to thread a line of controlling her sexuality and deploying it without fully using it, and like the fact that she never really questions the vision she had as a young person, and it all falls apart for her. Like, she is the biggest tragedy of the book for me, and always has been. And I absolutely was fascinated by her from so early on, and continue to be, really.
Yeah, really briefly, last week in Beverly, when I was with Chris, my answer was similar. Like I mentioned, Trash Can Man and Nadine as, especially. So this is one of the books I haven't reread a ton of times, like partly because it held such a place that this was the book that turned me into a reader. Like I avoided rereading it. So, right when you asked me to join the anthology, I was like, oh, I should reread the book. And it was definitely wild reading it almost 30 years after reading it the first time. And my reaction, obviously, I think when I first read it as a 22-year-old, it was Nick and everybody. But now that I sort of going into it, knowing what I know about the book, but also knowing what I know about sort of the history of horror afterwards, I found myself just really drawn to the more sort of gray characters of, the tragic, really backstories and histories of Trash Can and Nadine, for sure. And so when I wrote my story, obviously I wasn't writing about those characters, but one of the things that was, I wonder if you felt the same way, like, to me, I'd never done this before. I'd never got to play in some of the other IP, as you said. It was a fun pressure to have. It's like, oh, all these people are going to read this story will have read The Stand. So like, you don't have to world build. You get to just sort of like just jump right in, and either use expectations or undercut them and play with them. So, that was one of the exciting parts, one of the many exciting parts. But that was like, because it was a different writing experience, one that I had. That part of it was totally unique to me.
I think it's fun writing short fiction that way too, as well, because you can sort of allude to things that give an immediate depth to the story without having to do all of that groundwork. So you can kind of, I say this as somebody with a 12,000 word story in this collection, but like, you can move a little faster because you have all of this background you can rely on.
The weirdest thing for me is that I have seen a lot of social media posts by people who are going to read this book and then read The Stand for the first time. Which is so weird. I mean, that is just, if you know people like that, stop them before they make a terrible mistake. But it boggles my mind, but I love it anyway. I think it's great, but it's also just so weird. Anyway, were you signaling us, or should we?
We have time for one more quick one.
Okay, one more
Anyone
question.
has one?
Anyone? Go ahead, way back there. Tabitha.
Yes, sir. What have you guys been reading recently that you want to share with the class?
I can go. So I've been reading Catriona Ward. I read The Last House on Needless Street, which is amazing, and I just finished The Girl from the Well. I'm not totally sure how to pronounce the author's last name. I think it's Rin Chupico, but it's fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it, both of those.
I'm sort of like a blurb reading, which I'm not like fully finished with them, and I don't want to mention them yet, but I did squeeze in one just for pleasure, not for blurb. And it's called Foreclosure Gothic. And I would describe it as horror adjacent. I mean, there are these weird moments of strangeness and skirts up next to horror, but it's also like, it was a book that made me want to cry numerous times. It was a very sort of beautiful, different novel that really follows this one couple who meets in Los Angeles and eventually move out to the Hudson Valley, and they start buying foreclosed homes and fixing them up. And I don't know, again, there is some weirdness, like just out of the blue, that's like, whoa, where'd that come from? And it was just a very unique different book that I would recommend that, maybe under the radar because it wasn't like a hugely published novel that came out this summer. So Foreclosure Gothic.
So I do read a lot of books for blurbs, and so I'm trying to sort of put in other things that I can read at the same time. I recently read a massive biography of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall by William Mann called Bogey and Bacall. It's a really unique and interesting and peeling back the onion way to go about it. I loved that. I just read Sean Cosby's new one. Is it King of Ashes? Is that what it's called? And no surprise, it's excellent. I mean, he's one of my favorite writers right now. So talented. And the book that I'm reading for a blurb right now, I'm almost halfway through a book by Christina Henry. I've read about half a dozen of Christina's novels, and this book is coming out, I think, in November. And I think we're doing an event here in November, Christina and I, for that book. And it's called The Place Where They Buried Your Heart, or something like that. And I have to tell you, I've read a lot of haunted house novels. This is the best one I've read in such a long time. It is so mean, and I mean that in the best, most delicious way. It's terrific. It's narrated by an adult woman who, when she was a child and then a teen, lived 5 doors down from a house that ate her little brother. Even though that sounds like a children's book, The House That Ate My Little Brother, it's not. But it's terrific. It's really good. And there are pages I've actually turned down the page so that when I'm talking to her about it, I can sort of discuss some of the observations about families and things that she's made that kind of pass you by if you're just reading through and not really paying attention. But there are things I'll catch and I'll go, oh, that's telling. And I'm eager to discuss that with her. So that's been really cool. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to promote that book.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. That was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. So once again, we do have copies of the book for sale at the register behind our event space. We also do have a few pre-orders that need to be picked up as well. And if you would like your book signed, we can start the signing line here at the table and have it go towards the brick wall. Just keep lining up that way.